All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're going deep on something that might just turn your understanding of World War II upside down.
Yeah, this one's a doozy.
We're talking about Viktor Suvorov's Icebreaker and the frankly mind-blowing theory he lays out.
You think you know how World War II started? Think again.
Suvorov basically says forget everything you learned about Stalin being caught off guard by Hitler's invasion in 1941.
He claims the Red Army was actually gearing up for their own westward push.
Their own offensive.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty huge claim, right? I mean, the standard story is all about the Nazi-Soviet pact, Stalin buying time, totally terrified of the German war machine.
Right. The image we usually get is a weak Soviet Union scrambling to catch up, desperately trying to prepare for a Nazi onslaught.
So where does Suvorov even get this idea from?
Well, he completely flips that narrative.
Okay. How, yeah.
He says Stalin wasn't afraid of Hitler at all.
Huh.
He saw Hitler as, well, kind of a useful idiot almost. A tool to weaken Europe, setting the stage for a Soviet. Well, he frames it as liberation.
Liberation. Uh-huh, right. With a whole lot of air quotes around that word.
Yeah, liberation, Soviet style. Basically, install communist regimes across Europe. Suvorov argues Stalin had it all planned out, a two-stage play. First, let the capitalist powers beat each other senseless.
Blood and treasure. Wasted.
Exactly. Then, while they're licking their wounds, that's when the Red Army comes in, the icebreaker, he calls it. Sweep across a war-torn continent, totally primed for a communist takeover.
I mean, that's pretty Machiavellian. It's almost hard to believe. But is this just like some wild theory he cooked up? Or does he have anything to back it up?
He does actually present quite a bit of evidence. One big area he looks at is Soviet military doctrine, the kind of strategies and thinking they were focused on in the 1930s.
I guess that makes sense if you're trying to figure out their intentions.
Right, and Suvorov says, look, their whole military doctrine was overwhelmingly offensive in nature, focused on speed, on deep strikes into enemy territory, not hunkering down and defending.
So they were thinking about pushing outward, expanding.
Yeah. He even points to Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of the leading military theorists at the time.
Oh, yeah, I know that name, wasn't he?
Executed by Stalin in the purges.
Right. But before that, he was like a huge influence on Soviet military thought.
And get this, Tukhachevsky was all about forming these revolutionary committees, ready to go in and take control of conquered territory.
Hold on. So they're already planning the political administration of countries they haven't even invaded yet?
See, that's what Suvorov's getting at. It's not about defending the motherland. It's about conquest from the get-go.
And this isn't just some theoretical stuff, right? He actually links this to the kind of weapons they were developing.
Absolutely. Their hardware tells a similar story. For example, the BT tank. The thing was built for speed, pure and simple.
Not exactly your classic image of a lumbering Soviet tank.
No, not at all. It was designed to move fast, especially on paved roads, perfect for blitzing across Europe. They could even detach the tracks and run it on wheels for a while, like some kind of tank-car hybrid.
A tank that turns into a car. Okay, that's pretty cool, but I don't see how that's useful for defending Russia. A lot of mud, not so many paved roads.
Right. And then there's the amphibious tanks they were cranking out.
Amphibious, so they can cross rivers.
Exactly. Why build those in huge numbers if you're not planning to, invade someone else's territory? Cross those rivers and push forward.
I see where you're going with this. It's starting to sound like Suvorov might actually be onto something here.
It definitely challenges the whole poor defensive Soviet Union narrative, doesn't it?
Totally. What else is there? Are there any other weapon systems that sort of fit this offensive theory?
Oh, there are some pretty interesting ones. Take the IL-2 ground attack aircraft. Germans nicknamed it the flying tank. Heavily armed, designed to absolutely obliterate ground targets.
Sounds pretty fierce.
Oh, it was. But not so great for aerial combat, dogfighting. Much more of an attack weapon.
So again, we're seeing this theme of offense over defense. All right, so if Stalin was so set on attacking, why even bother with that whole non-aggression pact with Hitler? Wouldn't that just delay things?
That's where the real head-scratching starts.
Yeah.
See, Suvorov's theory says the pact wasn't about buying time for the Soviets to build up their defenses.
So it wasn't just stalling for time.
No, it was more like giving Hitler the green light, let him run wild, weaken the rest of Europe, and then...
Then Stalin waltzes in and picks up the pieces.
Exactly. It's like ridiculously cunning if you think about it. Use Hitler as this battering ram to clear the way for a Soviet takeover.
All right, so we've got this grand, almost unbelievably devious plan. But then what's with all this stuff about the Soviets dismantling their own defenses? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it?
It's one of the big mysteries in all of this, and one of the things that makes you really question the traditional story. We'll get into that right after this break.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got a Soviet Union that's not exactly cowering in fear of a German attack, but more like champing at the bit to go on the offensive themselves.
Yeah, Suvorov paints a picture of a regime that's, well, incredibly opportunistic.
But then the question becomes, if they were so ready to attack, why didn't they? What were they waiting for?
That's where things get really, really interesting. Suvorov's argument is that Stalin was basically orchestrating events.
Orchestrating, like a puppet master.
Pretty much waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. And there are a few key things that happened in those months before the German invasion that kind of support this idea.
Lay it on me. What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, for one, there's Stalin's sudden promotion to premier in May of 1941.
Premier. But wasn't he already running the show? I thought he was the general secretary of the Communist Party.
He was. But usually, those two roles, general secretary and premier, they were kept separate.
So this was like a power grab.
It definitely consolidated his power, no question. And the timing is just, well, incredibly suspicious.
Just weeks before the Germans attack.
Exactly. So what does this tell us? Well, Suvorov thinks Stalin wanted to be completely in charge.
To personally oversee the whole thing if they did launch an attack?
Right. No middlemen, no sharing power when it was time to unleash the Icebreaker.
Man, the guy was ruthless. All right, so we've got Stalin consolidating his power. What else?
Then there's this secret directive, issued on May 5th, 1941.
Secret directive. Sounds juicy. Do we know what it said?
Oh, the exact details are still a mystery. Tucked away in some Soviet archive somewhere, no doubt.
Of course they are. Figures. But we must know something about it, right?
We do. And what we know is pretty significant. It basically stressed that the Red Army should focus on offensive action.
Meaning?
Meaning they were to engage the enemy only when they got a direct order from the high command.
Not if they were attacked first.
Nope. It had to be on their terms, a planned attack, not a defensive reaction. Which kind of plays into what we were talking about before with those lightly armed units along the border.
They're cover armies.
Exactly. Those guys were just a distraction, a way to keep the Germans guessing while the real offensive force was getting ready further back.
Oh, okay, that's pretty sneaky. So basically, they're playing this incredibly high-stakes game of deception, trying to lull the Germans into a false sense of security. But at some point, all those troop movements, all that equipment, it must become impossible to hide.
You'd think so, right? I mean, we're talking about massive redeployments, troops and equipment pouring westward throughout the spring of 1941.
Drawn from all over the Soviet Union.
Everywhere. Siberia, the Far East, they even stripped units from internal districts. It was a huge logistical undertaking.
So people had to have noticed, right? Weren't there rumors flying around?
Oh, absolutely. Tensions were rising, and then comes the infamous TASS report on June 13th.
Refresh my memory, what was the TASS report again?
That was the Soviet news agency, basically putting out an official statement,
Yeah.
downplaying the whole idea of a German attack, saying Germany was sticking to the non-aggression pact, and the Soviet Union had no plans to attack them.
So a blatant lie.
Well, Suvorov sees it as a last-ditch effort to maintain the deception. The Red Army was almost in position, just needed a few more weeks. The TSA report was basically a smokescreen, keep the Germans guessing while they finalized everything.
But the smokescreen didn't work, obviously. Hitler launched Barbarossa on June 22nd. And, well, the rest, as they say, is history. But here's the thing. What if Hitler hadn't attacked? What if Stalin had gotten those extra few weeks he was maybe hoping for?
That's where Suvorov's theory goes from interesting to, well, downright mind-blowing. He suggests that if Hitler had stayed put, the Red Army would have been the ones to strike, probably sometime in July of 41.
Okay, so let's just imagine for a second that this alternate timeline actually happened. How would the Soviet offensive have gone down?
Well, picture this. The Ninth Army, that massive force we talked about earlier, they're all set, ready to pounce on Romania.
Romania? Why Romania?
Because at that time, Romania was like Germany's gas station. They were supplying a huge chunk of the oil that the German war machine depended on.
Ah, so taking out Romania would cripple their ability to wage war.
Exactly. No more Romanian oil, and those German tanks and planes are going to start sputtering pretty quickly. Meanwhile, you've got the other Soviet shock armies, these highly mobile, heavily mechanized units. They're surging westward.
Taking advantage of the chaos.
Oh, yeah. And they're facing a German army that's suddenly stretched thin, running out of fuel, and totally caught off guard.
Yeah. So in this alternate timeline, the Soviets potentially steamroll right through Europe, maybe even make it to Berlin before the Allies even land in Normandy.
It's a scenario that Suvorov lays out, and it's pretty wild to think about. Of course, it's all hypothetical, but it raises some really interesting questions about how differently things could have gone.
Let's talk about a turning point in history. But hold on a second. Before we get too carried away with these alternate realities, we have to acknowledge that Suvorov's theory isn't exactly universally accepted, right?
Right, it's definitely a controversial one. There are a lot of historians who just flat out disagree with his conclusion.
What do they say?
Well, some argue that he exaggerates the Red Army's capabilities, that they weren't nearly as prepared or as offensively minded as he makes them out to be, and that Stalin was genuinely caught off guard by the German invasion.
So the debate rages on. It's like one of those historical mysteries that we may never have a definitive answer to.
And that's part of what makes it so fascinating to explore, right? There are always multiple perspectives, different ways of interpreting the evidence.
It reminds us that history isn't always neat and tidy. It's messy, full of contradictions.
Exactly. And sometimes digging into those contradictions, looking at things from a different angle, can lead to some pretty startling insights.
Which is exactly what we're doing with Suvorov's theory, right? Even if we don't fully buy into it, it forces us to think critically, to re-examine what we thought we knew about World War II.
And that's never a bad thing.
All right, so we've got this intriguing, if controversial, theory about Stalin's intentions. But now we're left with this huge, almost terrifying question. What if he'd actually pulled it off? What would a world shaped by a Stalinist victory actually look like? That's a question that I'm both curious and a little bit terrified to explore. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time unpacking this icebreaker theory. Stalin, the mastermind, planning to take over Europe.
A very different picture of World War II than what we're used to, that's for sure.
But now I think we got to face the big, scary what if. What if he had actually succeeded? What would a world where Stalin won World War II actually look like? I mean, it's a fascinating question, but
Yeah.
kind of terrifying too.
Yeah, it's definitely a thought experiment that gives you pause. It forces us to confront the very real possibility of things turning out very differently. And when we consider what we know about Stalin and the Soviet Union, it's not a happy picture.
So paint that picture for us. What kind of consequences are we talking about here if Stalin had been the one to reshape Europe?
Well, first off, we're probably looking at a much, much larger Soviet empire. Suvorov makes the point that Stalin wasn't just content with defeating Germany. His goal, the grand vision, was to spread communism across the entire continent.
So it wouldn't just be Eastern Europe falling under Soviet control, like what actually happened.
Right, it wouldn't stop there. We'd be talking about all of Europe, from the Atlantic to, well, who knows where. Democracy, individual freedoms, all of that would be swept aside in this red tide.
Man, it's hard to even imagine what life would be like for people living under that kind of regime. I mean, we know the Soviet Union under Stalin was incredibly brutal.
Oh yeah, no sugarcoating it. It was a totalitarian state responsible for the deaths of millions of its own citizens, purges, gulags, forced famines. It's a dark, dark chapter in history.
And to think that could have been the fate of all of Europe. It's just chilling.
And the impact wouldn't stop at Europe's borders either. Imagine a Soviet Union, victorious, flush with resources, emboldened by their success. They'd pose an enormous challenge to the United States on the world stage.
So no Cold War as we know it, no two superpowers facing off.
Potentially not. It's possible we could have ended up with a world dominated by a single, incredibly powerful totalitarian regime, their influence stretching across huge parts of Europe and Asia. I mean, it's a sobering thought.
It really is. But is it possible things could have shaken out differently? I mean, even if Stalin had initially won, maybe things would change down the line.
Oh, absolutely. There are always those what-ifs. Maybe internal pressures within the Soviet Union would have eventually weakened their grip, or maybe there would have been strong resistance movements in the conquered territories. History's full of surprises. We can't predict every twist and turn.
That's true. But even if this hypothetical Soviet empire eventually collapsed, it's clear that the consequences of a Stalinist victory would have been massive, reshaping the world for generations. I mean, think about the political landscape, the social order, the economies. Everything would be different.
Without a doubt. It just goes to show how monumental World War II really was. Not just the battles and the victories, but the lasting impact it had on the course of history.
It's like this whole conversation, this whole deep dive into Suvorov's theory, it really highlights how important perspective is. We often look back at World War II through the lens of the victors. But Suvorov, whether you agree with him or not, He makes you consider a different angle, an alternate viewpoint.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of exploring these counterfactuals, these what-if scenarios. They make us question our assumptions, dig deeper into the nuances, realize that history isn't just a simple story with a clear beginning and end.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more layers to peel back when it comes to understanding the past.
And that's why we keep exploring, right? Keep asking those questions, keep searching for new insights, even if they challenge our comfortable narratives.
Well said. So, if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from our deep dive into Icebreaker, it's this. Stay curious, keep questioning, and remember that history is a living thing, constantly evolving as we learn more and as new perspectives emerge.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Icebreaker. We hope you enjoyed joining us on this journey through a fascinating and, well, slightly unnerving corner of history. Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.